The daughter-in-law's plan was flawless. Frame the husband, institutionalize his mother, and take the money. But she forgot one thing. A mother's love is the ultimate detective, and her payback is inevitable.
My name is Florence, but everyone who ever loved me just called me Flo. Right now, there aren't many of those people left. My husband, Robert, God rest his soul, has been gone 10 years. And my son, my only child, James, well, James is in a place where my love can't reach him, not really. He's in a federal prison, a place for criminals, though the only crime my boy ever committed was loving the wrong woman, a viper named Brenda, his wife, my daughter-in-law. And me? I'm in a different kind of prison. They call it Serenity Gardens, a place with pastel walls, sanitized smiles, and the faint, sweet smell of despair. Brenda put me here. She called it the best option for my long-term care after I started to decline following the shock of James's legal troubles. Oh, she's clever, my daughter-in-law, a master puppeteer. She thought she had it all figured out. Husband in jail, mother-in-law tucked away in a nursing home, family assets ripe for the picking. She thought I was just a sad, broken old woman who'd quietly fade away. She doesn't know me. She doesn't know what a mother is capable of when her child has been wronged. She thinks she ended the game, but she has no idea I'm about to start a war from this very wheelchair. You think you know this story? A greedy daughter-in-law, a framed son, a helpless old woman? Honey, you don't know the half of it. You don't know what I found or what I'm about to do. This isn't just a confession. It's a declaration of war. It wasn't always like this. Before Brenda slithered into our lives, we were happy. After Robert passed, it was just me and James. He was a good son, a wonderful man. He'd built a successful construction business from the ground up, his hands as skilled as his heart was kind. He insisted I live with him in the beautiful 2-story house he'd built, the one with the big porch and the garden where I grew my prize-winning tomatoes. He said he didn't want his mama living all alone. We were a team. Then came Brenda. She was a paralegal at a fancy law firm, she said. Smart, ambitious, beautiful. James was instantly smitten, and I, fool that I was, wanted my son to be happy. I welcomed her, ignored the little things that pricked at my intuition, the way her eyes would assess the value of things in our house, the subtle way she'd isolate James from his old friends, the way she'd ask just a few too many questions about his business finances, all under the guise of helping him get organized. They married, and for a while, everything seemed fine on the surface. Brenda took over the bookkeeping for James's company. "You're too busy building things, honey," she'd kurr. "Let me handle the boring numbers." James, who trusted her completely, was grateful. He was working on his biggest project yet, a community center, pouring all his time and energy into it. The trouble started about a year later. An audit. The IRS. Suddenly, there were accusations of tax fraud, falsified invoices, hidden income. James was bewildered. He'd always been meticulous, honest to a fault. But there it was in black and white, documents with his signature, transactions he couldn't explain. Brenda played the part of the supportive, horrified wife perfectly. She hired a lawyer, one of her old colleagues, who seemed more interested in arranging a plea bargain than in fighting the charges. It was a whirlwind of legal jargon, of mounting evidence that made no sense. James was confused, overwhelmed, trusting Brenda and her hand-picked lawyer to guide him. They advised him to plead guilty to a lesser charge to avoid a harsher sentence, swearing it was a misunderstanding, a paperwork error they couldn't disprove in time. My son, my honest, hard-working son, was painted as a tax cheat. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. The day he was taken away, my world fell apart. But Brenda was there, all efficiency and feigned sorrow. She took over everything. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mama Slow," she'd said, her arm around my shoulders. "I'll handle the business, the house. You just rest. The shock has been too much for you." And that's when her final act began. My grief, my confusion, my despair over James, she weaponized it all against me. I started having memory lapses, according to her. I was forgetting to pay bills. I was a danger to myself, leaving the stove on. After she'd distracted me and turned the knob herself, I now realize, she'd bring in a concerned doctor, a friend of hers, who'd nod gravely and talk about age-related cognitive decline. It was a masterful, cruel campaign. Within 2 months of James being sent to prison, Brenda, armed with a hastily arranged power of attorney and a doctor's recommendation, had me committed to Serenity Gardens. "It's what's best for you, Mama Flo," she'd said, her arm wrapped around my shoulders as she signed me in. "Now you can finally sell the house and the business assets to pay for James's legal fees and your excellent care here. Don't you worry about a thing." And just like that, the Viper had everything. My son in a cage, me in another, and our family's entire fortune in her perfectly manicured hands. She thought she had won. She thought I was finished. But as I sat here that first night, the silence broken only by the distant weeping of another forgotten soul down the hall, my grief began to cool, to harden, to sharpen into something entirely different. Something cold and clear and utterly relentless. She didn't know about the secret savings account Robert had left me, the one she couldn't touch. She didn't know about my old friend, Martha Henderson, the retired legal secretary with a mind like a steel trap. And she certainly didn't know me. She had jailed my son and dumped me in a home to die. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had left me with too much time to think. And a mother at war, honey, is the most dangerous creature on God's green earth. My war was just beginning.
Brenda thinks she has won, but she doesn't know what a cornered mother is capable of. From her room in the nursing home, Florence begins to plan her war. What resources can she find? And what will be her first move against the daughter-in-law who destroyed her family?
The first rule of war, I figured, is to know your battlefield. And my battlefield for now was Serenity Gardens, a place designed to neutralize you, to pacify you with soft foods and softer platitudes. But every fortress has its weaknesses, and I, Florence Flo Holloway, was going to find them. They thought they had a frail old woman in room 21B. What they really had was a patient, underestimated general plotting her campaign from deep within enemy territory. My secret weapon, aside from the righteous fury burning in my chest, was the small, untouched savings account my dear Robert had insisted I keep in my own name, separate from our main household funds. "For your rainy day, Flo," he'd always said, "a little something that's just yours." Brenda, in her greedy haste to seize the major assets, had overlooked it, or perhaps hadn't even known it existed. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't enough. It was my war chest. My first move was to contact Martha Henderson. Getting to a private phone was the initial challenge, just as it had been for others I'd heard about in similar situations. The phone in my room felt like a listening device. The lobby was too public. I found my opportunity in the facility's small, dusty library. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah who seemed more interested in her phone than in the residents, paid me little mind. I found a quiet corral in the back, shielded by shelves of large print romance novels, and made the call on a prepaid cell phone I'd asked a friendly visiting pastor to purchase for me with my rainy day funds, claiming it was to better keep in touch with my traveling grandchildren. Another lie and a life that was becoming full of them, but this one was for a righteous cause. "Martha?" I whispered when she picked up. "It's Flo." "Florence Holloway!" I was about to send out a search party. Her voice boomed, sharp and clear as always. "Brenda told me you were adjusting to a new facility. Sounded like a load of hogwash then, and I bet it is now. What has that viper done?" I poured out the whole sordid story. James in prison, the trumped-up tax fraud, me being put away, Brenda's control of everything. Martha listened without interruption, her silence punctuated only by an occasional, sharp intake of breath or a muttered, "That witch." When she finished, she didn't offer platitudes. She offered a plan. "Flo, this is bigger than just getting you out. We have to prove James was framed. We need to prove Brenda committed fraud. That's a federal crime, honey. We need a professional, not just a lawyer, but a forensic accountant, someone who can follow the paper trail she tried to create. Can we afford that, Martha?" I asked, the reality of my limited funds weighing on me. "We'll make it work," she said, her voice firm. "I know a guy, a retired IRS agent turned private investigator, name's Ben Carter. He's expensive, but he's a bloodhound. He lives for taking down frauds like your daughter-in-law. Let me make a call." While Martha worked her magic, my life in Serenity Gardens continued its monotonous rhythm, but now I moved with a secret purpose. I watched everything. I listened, I learned. The staff schedules, the delivery times, the moments when security was lax. I even started a small informal knitting circle that was less about knitting and more about information gathering. A few other residents, sharp old ladies who, like me, had been put here by caring relatives, became my unofficial intelligence network. We'd trade tidbits of gossip, observations about staff, warnings about which orderlies were a little too friendly with the administration. It was a small thing, but it made me feel less alone, less powerless. A week later, Martha called back with news. Ben Carter, the ex-IRS agent, was interested. He was intrigued by the details, smelling a classic case of fraud and exploitation. He had agreed to take a look, his initial fee covered by a transfer from my secret account. The war had officially begun. My next objective was to see James. I needed to see my son, to let him know he wasn't forgotten, to give him hope without revealing the full extent of my plans, which might put him at risk or get his own hopes up too soon. Getting permission to leave Serenity Gardens for a prison visit was a bureaucratic nightmare. It required doctor's approval, administrative sign-offs, all under the watchful eye of Brenda, who was still my legal guardian on paper. I had to play their game. I feigned a sudden, deep depression, a listlessness that concerned even the apathetic staff. I told the facility's resident psychologist that my only wish, the only thing that might lift my spirits, was to see my poor, misguided son one last time. It was a calculated performance, using their perception of me as a grieving, broken woman against them. It worked. After weeks of paperwork and feigned fragility, Brenda, likely seeing it as a harmless request from a defeated old woman, and perhaps eager to keep up appearances as a caring daughter-in-law, signed off on a supervised visit. The day I saw James in that sterile, gray prison visiting room was one of the hardest of my life. He was thin, pale, the light gone from his eyes. He looked defeated. "Mama," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper when he picked up the receiver on his side of the glass partition. "What are you doing here? Brenda said you were in a home, that you weren't well." "Brenda says a lot of things, baby," I said, my heart aching at the sight of him in that drab uniform. "I'm fine. I'm a tough old bird. I'm here to see you." We talked for an hour, the conversation stilted, painful. He was full of shame, still believing he was somehow at fault, that he'd let some detail slip, that he'd failed as a businessman. "None of this was your fault, James," I told him, my voice fierce, pressing my hand against the cold glass. "You hear me? You were set up. You are an innocent man." He just shook his head, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "It doesn't matter anymore, Mama. It matters to me, and we are going to get you out of here. I don't know how yet, but we will. You have to believe that. You have to keep fighting." I don't know if he believed me, but as I left that day, a new, even stronger fire was lit in my belly. It was one thing for Brenda to steal our money and our home. It was another to see what she had done to my son's spirit. She hadn't just jailed him, she had tried to extinguish his soul. And for that, there would be no forgiveness. Only a reckoning.
Flo has seen her broken son, and her resolve has turned to steel. With a hired investigator digging for evidence and a plan set in motion, her quiet war against Brenda is entering a new, more dangerous phase. What will they unearth? And how will Brenda react when she realizes the mother-in-law she wrote off is fighting back?
The quiet beige walls of Serenity Gardens became the backdrop to the most intense period of my life. On the outside, I was Flo Holloway, a quiet resident who enjoyed knitting and watching the birds. I smiled politely at the staff, I ate my mushy peas, I nodded along during the sing-alongs. But inside, I was a general poring over maps, a detective examining clues, a mother waging a clandestine war for her son's life and freedom. Every day was a tightrope walk between feigned fragility and a burning, secret resolve. Ben Carter, the ex-IRS bloodhound, was worth every single penny from Robert's rainy day fund. He worked quietly, meticulously, and with a kind of righteous zeal that I found deeply comforting. His updates, delivered via coded messages through Martha Henderson, were my lifelines. He started by examining the evidence used to convict James. He quickly discovered that the digital signatures on the key fraudulent tax documents were suspicious. They had the right timestamps, the right credentials, but something about the metadata felt off, as if they'd been applied under duress or by a program designed to mimic, not create. It was a thread, a small one, but enough to start pulling. The real breakthrough, however, came from following the money. Brenda, my dear daughter-in-law, was not as clever as she thought. She believed that by selling off James's business assets and moving the money from the sale of our house through a series of shell corporations, she had covered her tracks. But Ben Carter knew how to navigate those murky waters. He found it. A new, lavish life being built in Scottsdale, Arizona. A luxury condo purchased with cash, a brand new sports car, extravagant shopping sprees at high-end boutiques. She wasn't just paying for my care at Serenity Gardens. She was living like a queen on the ruins of my son's life. The rage I felt upon reading that report was so pure, so potent, it almost made me dizzy. The image of her sunning herself by a pool in Arizona while my Jane sat in a gray prison cell was an obscenity I could not let stand. But the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would become the linchpin of our entire strategy, was something even Ben hadn't expected to find. Brenda, it turned out, had an accomplice. In her haste to set up the fraudulent bookkeeping for James's company, she had hired a disgraced accountant, a man named George Petroff, to help her cook the books. Petroff had a history of this sort of thing and had apparently been a disgruntled former associate from her paralegal days. Ben Carter, through his old IRS contacts, found him. And Mr. Patroth, when faced with the prospect of being an accessory to federal tax fraud, was more than willing to talk in exchange for immunity. He had everything. Emails from Brenda detailing the plan, drafts of the falsified documents, records of the payment she had made to him for his silence. He had been her digital hitman, and now he was about to become our star witness. We had her. Cold. The day Martha called me with this final piece of news, I almost wept with relief in the library carol. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a clear path forward. Our new lawyer, a sharp, energetic man named David Chen, whom Ben Carter had recommended, took over James's case. Armed with Ben's evidence and a sworn affidavit from George Patroth, he filed an emergency motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence of a conspiracy to commit fraud. The wheels of justice began to turn, slowly, but they were turning in our direction now. Brenda must have been notified by her own lawyers because a few days later she appeared at Serenity Gardens unannounced. It was the first time I'd seen her since she dropped me here. She stormed into my room, her face a mask of fury, her usual practiced composure gone entirely. "What have you done, you old witch?" she hissed, closing the door behind her, her voice a low, venomous whisper. I looked up from my knitting, my heart hammering, but I forced my expression to remain calm, even a little confused. "Brenda, dear, what a surprise! To what do I owe this pleasure?" "Don't you play dumb with me," she snarled, her eyes blazing. "You think you can win? You're an old woman locked in a cage. I have power of attorney. I control everything." A slow smile spread across my face. "Do you now? That's funny, because my new lawyer, Mr. Chen, seems to think that power of attorney, obtained under fraudulent pretenses from a woman you were actively trying to have declared incompetent, might not be worth the paper it's printed on." The color drained from her face. She saw it then. The fight in my eyes. The fact that I wasn't the broken, hopeless victim she had left here. "You can't prove anything," she stammered, her bluster faltering. "Can't I now?" I said softly. "You should be more careful about who you hire to do your dirty work, Brenda. Sometimes they keep receipts." The look on her face at that moment, a mixture of pure, unadulterated terror and dawning realization, was almost worth all the pain she had put me through. Almost. She lunged towards me then, her hands reaching out as if to grab me, her face a mask of pure hate. "You will regret this, you old—" But just then, the door opened. A large, stern-looking orderly, one I'd never seen before, stood there. Behind him was my friend, Mrs. Albright from my knitting circle. Feigning concern. "Is everything all right in here, Mrs. Holloway?" the orderly asked, his gaze fixed on Brenda's aggressive posture. "Oh, dear me," Mrs. Albright chimed in. "This young woman seems very agitated. I hope she's not upsetting you, Florence." Brenda froze, then snatched her hands back, her expression shifting instantly to one of worried concern. "Of course not. I was just overcome with emotion, seeing my dear mother-in-law. We were having a very emotional discussion." The orderly didn't look convinced, but he nodded and stepped back. Brenda gave me one last look, a look that promised murder, then turned and stormed out of my room. I knew then that she was scared, and a scared animal is a dangerous one, but so is a mother fighting for her son. The battle was no longer being fought in the shadows. It was out in the open, and I was ready.
Flo has made it clear to Brenda that the game is up. With irrefutable evidence and a frightened but dangerous daughter-in-law, the final battle for James's freedom and Flo's justice is moving to the courtroom. How will this confrontation end?
The courtroom, the second time around, felt different. When I'd sat there for James's initial sentencing, it had been a place of cold, sterile horror. A place where truth was twisted and my son's life was stolen from him. This time, as I sat in the gallery watching Mr. Chen methodically present the new evidence at James's appeal hearing, it felt like an arena of justice, and my heart, though hammering with anticipation, was filled not with despair, but with the warrior's grim hope. Brenda was there, of course, a few rows ahead of me, looking pale and drawn, her expensive suit doing little to hide the tremor in her hands. She looked smaller somehow, her aura of smug superiority completely gone, replaced by the frantic, cornered look of a predator who has suddenly found itself the prey. She refused to meet my gaze. The hearing was a masterclass in legal maneuvering by Mr. Chen. He presented Ben Carter's forensic accounting report, a dry but devastating chronicle of Brenda's greed. He showed the court how the funds from James's business had been systematically funneled into shell accounts and then used to fund her lavish lifestyle in Arizona. He detailed the pattern of her exploitation, drawing a clear line from her taking over the company books to James's sudden, inexplicable tax problems. But the final, crushing blow was the testimony of George Petroff, the disgraced accountant. He took the stand, a nervous, sweating man, but his testimony was unshakable. He described in meticulous detail how Brenda had hired him, how she had laid out her plan to create a false paper trail, to fabricate invoices to effectively frame her own husband so she could liquidate the business assets without him interfering. He provided copies of their email correspondence, which Mr. Chen displayed on a large screen for the court to see. She said, Petroff stated, his voice trembling slightly, that with her husband in prison and his senile old mother soon to be in care, no one would be in a position to question her control of the finances. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. I felt the eyes of those around me turn to me, then to Brenda, whose face had gone a ghastly shade of white. I just sat there, my expression calm, my hands folded in my lap, a quiet, dignified old woman watching justice at long last unfold. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman who did not suffer fools gladly, overturned James's original conviction within hours. His case was dismissed with prejudice, his name cleared completely. More than that, based on the overwhelming evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and perjury presented, she immediately referred Brenda's case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Brenda didn't even look back as she was escorted from the courtroom by her lawyer, her perfect facade utterly shattered, revealing the hollow, panicked shell beneath. My war was won. The day James walked out of that prison, a free man, is a memory I will cherish for all my remaining days. I was there, waiting for him, along with Martha Henderson. When he stepped out into the bright sunlight, blinking, looking thin and overwhelmed but undeniably free, I cried. Tears of joy, of relief, of a love so fierce it felt like it could mend all the wounds the world had inflicted. We didn't say much at first. He just held me, his arms wrapped around me, his head buried in my shoulder, and I held him right back. My son, my boy, home at last. "Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion,
Mr. Chen told me. He told me everything you did from that place, how you never gave up." "A mother never gives up on her child, James," I said, looking up at his tear-streaked, beautiful face. "Never." The aftermath was a slow, gentle return to life. The legal mechanisms I'd set in motion resulted in my own guardianship being declared null and void. The day I walked out of Serenity Gardens for good, I made sure to stop by Mrs. Albright's room to say goodbye. "You give 'em hell, Florence," she'd cackled, pressing a small knitted bird into my hand. I squeezed her hand back. "We will," I promised. We got the house back. It had been put on the market, but our lawyer's injunction had stopped the sale just in time. It needed work, cleansing itself of the residue of Brenda's brief, venomous reign. But it was ours. Together, James and I began to rebuild, not just the house, but our lives. He was different, of course. The carefree optimism of his youth was gone, replaced by a quieter, more sober wisdom. But the core of him, his kindness, his goodness, remained untouched. He threw himself into restarting his business, this time with the cautious, wiser eye, but with the same passion for building good things. The money Brenda had stolen, some of it was recovered, but much of it was gone to her extravagant lifestyle and legal fees. It didn't matter. We had each other. We had our home. We had justice. And that was a wealth beyond measure. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, we sit on the porch swing, just like we used to, watching the fireflies flicker in the garden. We don't talk much about Brenda, or the prison, or Serenity Gardens. There's no need. They are shadows of a past we survived, scars that have faded into the tapestry of our lives. My son is free. He is whole again, or on the way to being whole. And I, Flo Holloway, the helpless old woman my daughter-in-law tried to discard, am at peace. I went to war for my son. It was a war I never wanted, a war that took everything I had. But I won. And in that victory, I found not just justice for James, but a strength within myself I never knew I possessed. She thought she had the last word when she jailed him to steal our money. But she didn't know his mother would have the final say. And my final say is this: love, true love, is the one force that can never, ever be imprisoned.